Our first speaker is Matt McBride, and Matt is the director of the Publications Division of the Church History Department, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He earned an MA in American History from the University of Utah. Matt is the author of House for the Most High, the story of the original Nauvoo Temple, and co-editor of Revelations in Context, the stories behind the sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. His article on the origins of Women's Missionary Program of the Church won the Mormon History Association's Best Article Award in 2018. He was previously the Digital Content Manager for the Publications Division, and prior to that, Director of Web Development and Director of Digital Publishing for Deseret Book Company. We're really happy tonight to have Matt McBride speak to us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Well, it's good to be here with you this evening. Especially excited to be here as our team over the past several weeks has been preparing for the imminent launch now of Saints Volume 4. I hope many of you are familiar with Saints. It's the first official history of the church, multi-volume history of the church that's been published since B.H. Roberts' Comprehensive History of the Church. It was published in its compiled form for the centennial of the church. And now, of course, we're approaching the bicentennial of the church, and excited to have completed now what was intended to be, at least for the time being, a 4-volume history of the church. I would like to take a little bit of time this evening to introduce you to the volume and maybe give you a sneak preview of one string of stories in the volume that I think is particularly meaningful. Before we dig in, though, I just want to kind of give you a sense of the ground that Volume 4 covers. So at the end of Volume 3, for those of you who were following along, the church had begun its second century. World War II was over, but much of the world remained ideologically divided. Local leaders were serving in Central and South America, in the Pacific, in Asia, Europe, and South Africa. The church was enjoying more acceptance in North America and Europe, and David O. McKay had dedicated the Swiss temple and announced new temples in England and New Zealand. So as we head into Volume 4, Volume 4 covers 65 years of church history, and it goes from 1955 until 2020. And of course, the series begins recounting the events leading up to the first vision. Volume 4 concludes at the 200th anniversary of the first vision, as we celebrate that bicentennial in General Conference in April of 2020. The volume then has this engaging narrative that covers 65 years of church history. It includes stories about everyday Latter-day Saints in North and South America, Asia, Europe, the Pacific, Africa. Gives insight into the lives and ministries of Latter-day prophets, and we hope that it will inspire testimonies of Jesus Christ and of the restored gospel. You can see here the cover of the volume. One thing you have likely noticed if you've read the other books is that the books of each up to this point culminated with a significant temple dedication. Volume 1 in Nauvoo, Volume 2 in Salt Lake, Volume 3 in Switzerland. Volume 4 culminates with a flurry of temple dedications in the 2000 teens. And you can see this proliferation of temples reflected in the cover of the book, which features an imaginary landscape that includes the Manila, Philippines temple, the Accra, Ghana temple, the temple in Mexico City, the temple in Hong Kong, and a temple in São Paulo, Brazil. And that temple and the others are featured in the story of the book and the narrative that we tell. It's a period of growth for the church, certainly, but we wanted to make this not just a story about growth and a story about the church emerging in new places and growing. There are also some other really just interesting themes that this volume kind of has us think about and reflect on as you read the stories. And I'll just share a couple of those quickly here. I'd like to get into telling a few more specific stories. The first theme is that in 1955, when the volume begins, 90% of church members live in the U.S. and Canada. And of course, by 2020, less than half of the membership of the church live in the U.S. and Canada. At the time the volume begins, most converts are coming from white Anglo-European backgrounds. And by 2020, most are coming from Latin America and Africa. And this is a sea change. This is a drastic change that occurs over this time period, and you'll see that change reflected in the selection of stories that are told in this volume. It's the books are called Saints because we tell the story of not only church leaders but of everyday Latter-day Saints who are striving to live the gospel in the various circumstances in which they live around the world. A second theme is that in 1955, when the volume begins, there are some really specific sociocultural and political barriers that impede the church from carrying out its mandate and its mission. And one of the interesting stories that unfolds throughout the volume is the way that many of these barriers shift or even fall. A third theme, the church begins to see itself not only as an organization that is seeking to convert people to its beliefs, its theology, but also as an entity that is to ameliorate suffering and pain. And of course, during this time period, we see the founding of LDS Charities and a number of important institutional developments, and we tell the story of those developments as we always do through the stories of individual Latter-day Saints who participate in those events. And so that's yet another theme. At the turn of the 21st century, there are these exciting technological innovations that revolutionize the world and that inspire the church and its members to find new ways to carry out the Lord's work. And so, as you might expect, we tell stories about the church's website and family search and the way that these and other technologies and the way that they change what it means to live the gospel and to carry out this consecrated labor. And then finally, and this is getting back to this idea of temples and the way that temples and temple building have structured the entire series, really. In 1955, there are 9 temples operating. It's kind of amazing to think that. By the end of the volume, there are 168 operating temples around the world. And we get a chance through this volume to see stories not only about how that proliferation of temples happened and the inspiration that was involved in that process, various church leaders, of course, involved along the way, including notably President Gordon B. Hinckley, but also what that has meant to Latter-day Saints around the world who now have the opportunity to worship in a temple more proximate to their home, to attend the temple more frequently, and to enjoy those blessings. So that's just kind of an overview of some of the themes. In the course of reading Volume 4, you'll be introduced to a lot of fascinating characters. You'll get to meet a 13-year-old primary president named Delia Rochon, who was a new convert to the church, and as many of us are, daunted by this new responsibility and calling that her branch president gave her. We get to see the work that she does with these children, the difference that she makes in their lives, and then how they work together as a group to bless others. You get to be introduced to an innovative General Young Women's President, Ardith Green Cap, who just does some remarkable work to revolutionize and change the young women's programs of the church, introducing the values and the personal progress program as we knew it for many, many years. You'll be introduced to a Methodist pastor in Brazil who later in the book becomes a Latter-day Saint bishop. And we get to learn about what that experience of conversion was like for him and for his family. And there are many, many other characters that you'll meet. And so we're just excited for you to engage with this volume. I want to just let you know that it is scheduled to be launched on the 29th of October. So that's a few Tuesdays from now. It'll be available in 14 languages digitally in the Gospel Library app when we launch it. It'll be available in really excellently recorded audiobook formats in several of those languages, and then available in print in English on day one, and then other languages on a kind of a staggered basis going forward in the coming weeks. So we're just so pleased and so excited about Volume 4. Now, I want to talk a little bit tonight about Volume 4, having kind of given that little bit of an introduction. In the context of the work that FAIR does and the work that this conference, I think, is structured around, which is the work of helping others to understand church history and the work of defending church history. And Saints plays a particular role in the ecosystem of content, at least that the church history department, of course, publishes. And of course, we're part of a larger ecosystem of many others who are involved in this effort. Saints does some of this work of fostering understanding and defending the restoration by taking the story of the restoration and including some of the challenging and difficult elements and including those together in a broader context so we can see the way that those maybe more challenging threads fit into the bigger picture and tapestry that is church history. The other thing that I've been struck by as I read the books is the way that the art of the creative writing approach that is taken by Saints and the talented writers that we have working on these volumes, the way that it forces us as 21st century readers and travelers in the past, if you will, to put ourselves into the subjective of the people we're reading about, to walk a mile, so to speak, in their shoes. The narrative approach demands that we don't give the end of the story away. This is not how you do. That's not how you do good narrative writing. It's that approach and that style involves withholding information and allowing the drama to kind of unfold as it goes. But the effect of that on a reader who's trying to understand church history is to, I think, and in my experience, to gain a new kind of empathy for these historical actors, for the challenges that they face, for the fact that they didn't know the end from the beginning as they were living through their experiences. And so it draws you into their lives, and as I suggested, gives you an empathy for them that I think is needed as we approach our past. And there's so many other things that Saints does. I want to call out the fact that although Saints is written in a narrative format, and we don't often, if ever, pause to analyze and to do kind of the exposition that you might normally see in a work of history, there are resources that are published as a part of the larger project that do just that. So as you read the stories in Saints and you encounter, as do the historical actors and characters, as we call them, that you will encounter and read about in the books, you'll encounter a question, a challenge, a topic, and the book itself and its notes will point you not only to the primary sources that we used to tell the stories, but also to resources that we published in conjunction with Saints that approach these topics in a more traditional expository writing approach. And most of that occurs in what we call the Church History Topics, another collection in the Gospel Library app. And with Volume 4, we're releasing another about 30 topics. And at the end of the day, there are more than 250, and they cover topics ranging from seer stones and revivalism in the 1820s to the United States Civil War, to questions of slavery, to just you name it. So it's fairly wide-ranging, and I think a really great resource for people who have specific questions about specific topics. So the church and organizations like FAIR and many others work hard to provide substantive answers to the specific questions that people have about our history. And for those of us who do this, you know it feels a little bit like playing whack-a-mole sometimes. New questions pop up and we rush to formulate a helpful answer. And it's really good to provide answers to questions. But accurate information and well-reasoned responses are not enough. We need to help Latter-day Saints become better questioners and better seekers. In order to do that, they need principles for approaching church history questions as much as they do the content of the specific answers we might try to provide. If we master the skill of examining and approaching our questions, then as new questions arise, we will be more spiritually and intellectually self-sufficient and less vulnerable to whatever the latest supposed gotcha is. Now, one good resource that teaches an approach is found in the Topics and Questions section of Gospel Library. And I want to use this to frame some of these stories that I want to share with you from saints tonight. I think this is a helpful frame for us to think about these stories. Now, this section features advice on seeking to understand the process of revelation, on centering our faith on the Savior, on assessing our sources of information, exercising patience with ourselves and others, contextualizing historical events in a way that promotes understanding. And you can see what those, on this slide here, what some of those kind of principles are at a really high level. And as you click on each one in the Gospel Library app, you can drill down and see that there are additional resources, thoughts, and perspectives on that principle. Well, I just want us to keep those principles in mind as I talk about saints now for a few minutes. Saints teaches these principles, and it teaches them in two ways. It teaches them through the stories and characters on its pages, and it teaches them through the process that was used to compile and write the books. And I'll just talk briefly about that near the end of my remarks. But I want to emphasize one principle to start, and that is that this one that's titled here, Revelation. Recognize that revelation is a process. So revelation is a process. What does that mean? What's the process? The article, if you take the time to tap on it and read it, will note some things that you might expect. It will note that that revelation requires faith, that it can be a spiritual struggle that takes time, that it comes by means of the Holy Ghost. These are all true. The article also suggests that, in a sense, all revelation is to some extent culturally mediated. It begins with questions, which means that it begins with questioners. People who live in historically contingent circumstances and whose questions arise from those circumstances. And then when the revelation is given, it is given in our language and to our understanding. And of course, languages are cultural productions. They not only reflect our world, but they help shape it. Saints tell stories of mortal questioners who struggle to know the way, who reach out to God, and then God reaches back. Not typically with a spectacular manifestation or an earth-sundering miracle, but in subtle ways that demonstrate a deep respect for his children's agency. These stories show the Lord's direction distilling upon prophets as the saints as the dews from heaven. Sometimes revelation is given thanks to the combined agency, faith, and prayers of multiple people. And these are my favorite kinds of stories. They make me think of Michelangelo's creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel. God reaches out, yes, but it's only when his children learn to reach back that the work moves forward. The spot where God's finger and Adam's finger meet in that painting is where the magic happens. So I'd like to dedicate just the next few minutes of my remarks to telling a couple of such stories. I'm going to tell one each from volumes 2 and 3. I'll try to be brief, and then I want to give you a sneak preview of a string of stories from the forthcoming 4th volume. So the first story that I want to tell emerges in volume 2, and it deals with the translation of the Book of Mormon into Spanish. And it's a story that involves a lot of different people. In 1851, Brigham Young sends Parley P. Pratt on a mission to Chile. He goes there. It's a largely unsuccessful mission in terms of converts and in terms of establishing a more permanent presence, and he returns home. And as he reports his mission in the Bowery in Salt Lake, he says, "Until The Book of Mormon is translated into Spanish and is in the hands of the elders in that part of the world. The work's not going to go forward. And then he commits himself and says, until then, you consider Brother Parley on the Spanish mission. Of course, he is assassinated shortly thereafter. And for 20 years almost, there's really not any progress made on this, what Pratt deemed a really important and a significant priority. And I think that priority is somewhere in Brigham Young's mind throughout this period. Of course, it's a tumultuous period, but by the time we get to the mid-1870s, Brigham Young is ready to act. He's prompted to reach out to a young man named Daniel Webster Jones. So we've got Pratt and we've got Young. Now we have Jones. Jones's backstory is that he is an orphan, and he falls in with some a trading party that's traveling through Mexico, trading their wares as a means of making a living. Jones learns Spanish through this process. And as he's returning north from Mexico after a trading trip, they pass through Utah, they pass through Provo, and for some reason Daniel Webster Jones looks around him and says, I think I want to stay here. And in spite of the fact that his friends kind of tease him and make fun of him, he stays put. I got to advance. So we've involved Brigham here. Parley P. Pratt. I don't have pictures of everyone here. There's Daniel Webster Jones. He falls in with a man named Henry Brizet, who has also learned Spanish. And Brigham Young approaches these two and asks them to translate the Book of Mormon and to prepare to open a mission in Mexico. But they both feel like they can't do it, and they both kind of speak to each other and say, if only we had a good native Spanish speaker, we could do this rather quickly. Well, meanwhile, other side of the world, in the Philippines, there's a Spanish officer named Melitón Trejo who has a dream. And he, I think earlier in his life, had encountered a tract that John Taylor had published in France, if I understand the story correctly. And so he had kind of a vague familiarity with the church. And as he's sleeping one night in his cot in the Philippines on this military expedition, he has a vision and a dream and when he awakes, he knows he needs to move to Utah and to gather to the church. And in spite of the jeers of his fellow soldiers, he leaves, and he makes what at the time would have been a fairly arduous journey. It's bad enough to fly across the Pacific on an airplane. He made it to Utah, and he showed up in a Spanish Army uniform and with very little knowledge of the English language, and was quite a sight on the streets of Salt Lake City. He's soon introduced to Daniel Webster Jones and Henry Brizet, who say, this is the person we said we needed. And they set to work. And Jones and Trejo in particular work on this translation, Trejo being the primary translator and Jones assisting. And when the work is complete, they need to publish it. So what do? They reach out, and 500 Latter-day Saints in Utah subscribe and make a payment and a donation, and they are able to publish selected passages from the Book of Mormon. They in a pamphlet form, and they take them and they bundle them up and put them on the backs of their mules, and they're off to Mexico. At least some of them. Trejo does not participate in that first mission. A couple of years later, he and Moses Thatcher and James Zebulon Stewart do go to Arizona, through Arizona to Mexico, and dedicate Mexico for the preaching of the gospel. They decide to publish a tract. They say, what's the first thing we need to do? And Trejo says, we need to translate A Voice of Warning by Parley P. Pratt, our missionary to Valparaiso all those years ago. They translate the pamphlet, and in Spanish it's called Una Voz de Amonestación. Meanwhile, many miles away in northern Mexico, a woman named Desideria Quintanar de Yañez, and we don't have a picture of her, unfortunately, so we'll make do with this representation here. She has a dream of a book called Una Voz de Amonestación. And she talks to her son and says, I need you to go into Mexico City, which is not a short journey, and to go there and to find the people who are publishing this book. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. But he was a dutiful son, and he went anyway, and he met Plotino Rodacanati, Militon Trejo, and others who were working on the translation. It was still at press and not available, but they gave him other church materials to take to his mother. She's baptized. Okay. So that's kind of the narrative thread. What do we make of this? The Lord had a work he needed done, and he worked patiently through numerous human agents to see it done. And note how he worked with them. It's a prophet feeling an urgent spiritual need, a dream to a Spanish officer a half a world away from Utah who had needed language skills, a subtle prompting to an orphan passing through Provo, the goodwill and consecrated donations of 500 Latter-day Saints, the dream of a spiritually seeking woman, and the reluctant obedience of her devoted son. And the end result is the foundation of a mission in a country where there are now 1.5 million Latter-day Saints and will soon be 20 temples. Revelation is a process. Revelation distills. Revelation is scattered among us. Let's turn briefly to Volume 3. And the story I want to highlight there just quickly is the story that begins actually with an acerbic anti-Mormon named William Jarman who's spreading lies about the church in England. He's particularly harsh on the church and makes accusations about what life as a Latter-day Saint woman is like in a polygamous system. And he's not the only one who's leveling these accusations. This is a challenge that missionaries are facing in many parts of the world, the eastern United States, California, Great Britain in particular. And in the eastern United States, Emma Piper, a woman, stands up and defends the church against these accusations. In California, Harriet Nye, the wife of the mission president, does the same. In England, a woman named Elizabeth McCune, who was a wealthy woman and decided, I'd like to go on a trip to my homeland to do some genealogical research, sought a blessing from Lorenzo Snow, and he blessed her that her mouth would be opened as she preached the gospel, leaving her to wonder exactly what that meant or would mean. When she arrives in England, she discovers that this William Jarman is causing the missionaries fits. The mission presidency is concerned, and one of its members, Joseph W. McMurrin, feels prompted at a public conference meeting in London in, we think, late 1897 to invite this woman, Elizabeth McCune, to stand up and talk about her experience as a woman in Utah. She does not like to public speak, but she overcomes her fears and she speaks, and the effect is electric, and this is noticed by Joseph W. McMurrin, who writes a letter to President Wilford Woodruff. And he and his counselors prayerfully consider this letter and decide that it's time to call women as full-time proselytizing missionaries, something that had never been really done in the church during the first 70 years of its existence, although women had served in the mission field alongside their husbands in various capacities. A bishop in Provo, Utah, hears George Buchanan announce this. Oh, I'm behind on my slides. There's Elizabeth McCune. There's Joseph McMurrin. And incidentally, McMurrin earlier that same year, introduced an idea that I would argue led to the eventual creation of missionary discussions. He was quite an innovator. His letter went to President Woodruff, who had George Buchanan announce this new policy in General Conference, and a bishop in Provo named Edward Partridge was listening carefully, and he recognized that a young woman in his ward was preparing to travel to England for a vacation. He approached her and asked her if she'd be willing to serve a mission, and Inez Knight, who's pictured here, was one of the first two young single women called to serve missions in the history of the church. Again, revelation was, in this instance, scattered among them, as we often say. It was a prompting to a mission presidency member, to a woman to make her voice heard, a woman who overcame her fear of public speaking to share her experience, members of the First Presidency who considered these circumstances prayerfully and decided to call women as missionaries, a bishop who responded to their call, a young woman who consecrated 2 years of her life to preach in England. The result is a tradition of sending sister missionaries out into the world that has resulted in hundreds of thousands of lives changed, and that's not including the converts of the sisters who have served. So let's now turn to Volume 4, and I'm really happy to talk about one of my, I think, favorite story threads that constitutes much of the first half of the book. The first half of Volume 4 features, among other things, this string of stories that lead up to the landmark revelation given to President Spencer W. Kimball in 1978, extending the blessings of the temple and priesthood to all worthy Latter-day Saints regardless of their race. And this is a story thread that we follow through each of the last 3 volumes of the series to some extent, but its culmination marks the midpoint of Volume 4. And in my telling, I'm going to go against the advice of our story writers. I'm going to start at the end. I'm going to start at the end because in the sense that I want to read this paragraph from Official Declaration 2, which is the announcement of the revelation that President Kimball received. And that declaration reads, "Aware of the promises made by the prophets and presidents of the church who have preceded us, that at some time in God's eternal plan all of our brethren who are worthy may receive the priesthood, and witnessing the faithfulness of those from whom the priesthood has been withheld. We have pleaded long and earnestly in behalf of these our faithful brethren, spending many hours in the upper room of the temple, supplicating the Lord for divine guidance." 2 phrases, aware of the promises, witnessing the faithfulness, suggest a process of revelation much like the stories I've related from the previous volumes. Stories that feature multiple agents, multiple events occurring over nearly 2 decades, some big questions, and then a humble prophet of the Lord who sought divine guidance. The story, or the stories, begin in 1959 in Volume 4 when Spencer Kimball, Elder Kimball, visits South America. And while in Argentina, he meets a church member who could not hold the priesthood because he had African ancestry. The man was discouraged, sure that the priesthood restriction prevented him from serving in any church calling. "I can't even be a doorkeeper, can I?" he said. Elder Kimball felt his heart sank and said, "You can serve wherever priesthood is not a requirement." And he said this hoping that assurance gave the man some comfort. Well, at this early date, Kimball recognized that almost 40% of Brazil's population had African ancestry. And this raised questions about the future growth of the church in this country, particularly in its northern states, which had a large black population. Cut ahead. A few years later in West Africa in the 1960s, a man named Anthony Obina in Nigeria has a dream of a building with 6 spires. And in the dream, the voice tells him, a voice told him that people enter into this building every day and they pray. Later, he happens on an American magazine featuring an article about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with a picture of a temple he had seen. At the time, he wasn't able to write church headquarters because of a wartime blockade, nor was he aware that there were unofficial Latter-day Saint congregations elsewhere in Nigeria, and that's a story we also tell in this volume. They had formed earlier in the 1960s. Many of them had scattered during the war, lost contact with each other and with the church. Some believers, including one man whose story we tell, whose name was Honesty John Ekong, was never heard from again. But now that the war was over, nothing could keep Anthony from contacting the church. And so he wrote to church leaders asking for church literature and church missionaries. Just a little further west in Ghana, similar story playing out. Some of these may be familiar stories to you. A man named Raphael Mensah gave his friend Billy Johnson a copy of the Book of Mormon and some other Latter-day Saint literature, and Johnson quickly became converted by what he read and what he felt. Now, over time, his faith was affirmed by remarkable dreams and visions. Shortly after Mensah had introduced him to the restored gospel, Billy was praying, and he saw the heavens open and a host of angels appear, blowing trumpets and singing praises to God. "Johnson, Johnson, Johnson," a voice called to him. "If you will take up my work as I will command you, I will bless you and bless your land." the same time, the succeeding years were difficult. His wife did not share his religious beliefs. They ended up divorcing. He was led to reject offers from other churches to become a pastor in their traditions. And he waited patiently. One night, alone in his bedroom, he wept, "Lord, what should I do? I have waited for so long, and my brothers have not come." And he heard a voice say, "Johnson, don't ever confuse yourself or your members," meaning the members of the congregations that he had formed. "Stay fast to the church, and very soon your brothers will come and assist you." They continued to meet. They liked to sing the song, "Come, O thou King of Kings, we've waited long for thee." I want to pause here and note the patience that these faithful Black Latter-day Saints exercised as they waited, and then remind you that there's another set of principles in that seeking answers to our questions section around this important virtue of patience with ourselves and patience with others, patience with the Lord and his timing. This all can help us as we approach our difficult questions. One final story before we reach the conclusion of this arc. The Martins family in Brazil, Helvécio, Huda, and their children joined the church. They're a black family in Brazil. They recognize and understand the priesthood restriction, know that this means that their son can't serve a mission, that Helvécio cannot serve in church callings, and that the newly announced São Paulo temple was not a place that they would be able to enter. At the same time, they felt prompted to save money for Marcus's, their son's mission. They accepted a calling as public affairs representatives for the church, whose job it was to help with public relations during the construction, the open house, and dedication of the São Paulo temple. There's a touching scene in which Huda and Helvécio stand there on the construction site on the spot where the celestial room would be, and they embrace each other and weep, hoping and praying that somehow those blessings can come to them and their family. They receive an assurance from President Kimball that they will indeed, who was visiting Brazil, that they will indeed have all of the blessings of the gospel, and they were left to wonder what that meant after President Kimball left and returned to the United States. President Kimball's experiences in person with the Martins family in Brazil, and by means of the letters that were sent by converts in West Africa, were some of the ways in which he witnessed the faithfulness of black people. The Saints also tells how he became aware of the promises that were made by previous prophets. Several church presidents themselves, of course, had made statements in the first place. And then President Kimball asked people around him, including historians, including other general authorities, to help him compile as much information as they could about the views of previous church leaders on this topic. Good revelation starts with good information. He formulated his questions. He prepared his heart. He asked for the thoughts of fellow church leaders, and he prayed fervently. And then he received a revelation in June of 1978 and had that revelation miraculously confirmed to him and to other members of the First Presidency and 12 in the Temple. And one of my favorite chapters in Saints Volume 4 is a chapter that goes through and allows each of or many of the individuals who are involved in that remarkable experience to share their own account of what happened to them that day in the temple. Well, Darius Gray, I'm again behind on my slides. I'm so good at this. Let's take a minute here. There's Joseph William Billy Johnson. There's Anthony Obina in Nigeria. There's President Kimball. And now we want to talk about Darius Gray. He was a young black man in the 1960s who had read the Book of Mormon and joined the church. He remained faithful despite experiencing discrimination from some church members. He defended the church to students and journalists in the wake of a boycott of BYU athletics over the priesthood restriction. He worked at KSL for some time, and his manager was Heber Woolsey, and they had become good friends. And about 8 days after President Kimball's prayer, on the day when what's now Official Declaration 2 was announced, Darius was sitting in his office at a paper company in Salt Lake City when a coworker poked her head into the room, and she said she'd heard that the church was now giving the priesthood to black men. Darius thought she was making a bad joke. "That's not funny," he told her. "No, really," she insisted. She had just spoken with a customer at the church administration building. There were rumors that President Kimball had received a revelation extending the blessings of the priesthood and temple to all worthy members of the church. Skeptical, Darius picked up the phone, dialed the number for President Kimball's office. A secretary told him that President Kimball was in the temple. But he confirmed that the rumors were true. The prophet had indeed received a revelation on the priesthood. Darius was stunned. He could not believe the news. Nothing had prepared him for it. After Darius heard the news, he went to Temple Square. The whole block was buzzing with excitement. Darius spoke to a news reporter about the revelation and then walked across the street to the office of his old friend Heber Woolsey, his former boss at KSL, who was now the director of public communications for the church. Heber wasn't in. His secretary asked Darius to stay. "I know he would want to see you," she said. Darius waited. Heber's office overlooked the east face of the Salt Lake Temple, and the sun was high and bright, and through the window Darius could see the stones of the temple gleaming. Before long, Heber returned to his office. As soon as he saw Darius, he gathered him in a tearful embrace. "I never thought," Heber whispered. Darius looked at his friend and then out the window at the temple, and he knew that the revelation would not just affect the present and the future, it would affect the past as well. For the first time in this dispensation, people like him, living and dead, would have a chance to receive every available ordinance in the temple. Darius looked back at Heber, closed his eyes, and then slowly opened them again. "God is good," he said. You take just a minute to talk. Well, those are some ways. Those are some ways that the stories of saints help teach these principles of to be patient with yourself and with others, to recognize that revelation is a process. Looking at the next two principles, I'll be very brief on this. Working to understand the past, consulting reliable sources. We hope that the way that we have approached saints as a historian and writer team, that we are modeling and teaching some of these principles about the importance of evaluating the reliability of our sources, learning to recognize bias, corroborating what we learn, recognizing the limits of our knowledge, expecting change, placing things in context, remembering that humans make mistakes. This is a statement from the Note on Sources in Saints, and I don't have that quite close enough to my eyes to read it for you. Let's see. This volume is a work of narrative, non-fiction based. Okay, this is not going to be good. I'm going to step forward just for this part, okay? This volume is a work of narrative nonfiction based on hundreds of historical sources. Utmost care has been taken to ensure its accuracy. Readers should not assume, however, that the narrative presented here is a perfect or complete narrative. The records of the past and our ability to interpret them in the present are limited. All sources of historic knowledge contain gaps, ambiguities, and biases. They often convey their creator's point of view, and witnesses of the same event experience, remember, interpret, and record them differently. The challenge of the historian is to assemble known points of view, piece together an accurate understanding of the past. Every source in Saints was evaluated for its credibility, and each sentence was repeatedly checked for consistency with the sources. And we hope that this can serve as a model. It's often submerged as you read Saints, kind of the method that's behind it, but I hope you'll take the time to at least peruse the sources in the back of Saints, and to read the entire Note on Sources, which I think serves as a good model for how we can approach at least historical questions and historical inquiry with the kind of rigor that we need to in the world in which we live. Let me just conclude here. The last one is center your life on Jesus Christ, and I want to conclude with this. This is a scripture that we hope describes all of the individuals whose stories we tell in saints. A lot of times we'll talk about saints as a small plates history, where we've tried to tell the sacred story of the restoration to help you see how the Lord's hand is working with individuals to carry his work forward. And I hope those stories I've told tonight have given you a sense of what that looks like and how that plays out in our history and in these books. But each of these individuals whose stories we tell are human beings, and they have their limitations and they make their mistakes. And this scripture is something we think describes what it looks like to see them as they reach out to the Lord and transform their lives and the lives of those around them. For the natural man is an enemy to God and will be forever and ever unless he yields to the enticings of the Holy Spirit, putteth off the natural man, and becometh a saint through the atonement of Christ the Lord. Ultimately, that's the purpose of saints, is to not only teach us principles about how to approach questions we might have about church history, as important as that may be, but to help us to look back and to see the Lord's hand in the lives of his children. In the Christian tradition, there are different senses in which people talk about revelation. God is revealed through nature. He's revealed through the Bible and its history and his interactions with people over time. And he's revealed to us as we reach out to him through his Spirit and we feel his presence. We think that saints can help play a role in all of that by helping people to look back on the history of the restoration and get an honest and a fair look at how those processes of revelation, those processes of God reaching out to his children play out, and what it looks like and what it means to be one of those people who then reach back and seek and receive that revelation and then turn around and consecrate their lives to doing the work that the Lord is trying to do in the world and among his children. I just want to conclude by encouraging you to take the time to read saints and to read these stories. There's power, spiritual power, that comes through putting yourselves into the shoes and the perspectives of these people who are saints who have gone before us, to recognize what that means to try to reach out to the Lord. And my testimony is that the Lord does reach back as we follow those examples and seek to do that in our own lives. And I'll share that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
So thank you so much for that presentation. I thought it was really interesting. I'm always amazed by the individual stories you have in all four books of saints. And it makes me wonder how, this is a little behind the scenes stuff. How do you choose which stories to include, and where do you get these stories? You have stories from the Philippines, from Switzerland, from all over, from Africa. And how do you get those?
Well, the process of selecting the stories, as you can imagine, has gotten more and more complicated as we've moved from volume 1 to volume 2 to 3 and then to 4, just because of the scope of the history that we're trying to cover. We go from a church that starts in a family to a church that's global with millions of people in different places. So there are a lot of criteria that we use along the way. One of them I kind of alluded to, which is that this is a small plates history, so it's important for us to find stories that are achieving those purposes of trying to help people see what it means to live a life of faith. It's important for us, and I think this is really significant, that from a historical standpoint, that we've structured this what's kind of a work of narrative nonfiction in a very careful, historically rigorous and accurate way, that the most important themes are represented. And so there's a lot of care that's done to create outlines, and I think the historians on our team are some of the most talented historians that I've worked with. They have such a range of knowledge, and they work with so many experts in so many subfields as they put together lists of kind of what are the key things that we need to be focusing on. They do a lot of review of historical literature to make sure we understand that although we're structuring this narratively, the structure really is as reflective as it can be of what we think the most important historical trends are. The stories have to have good sources. So let that be a lesson to all of us would-be record keepers out there. And what we found is that it's different to find a story that has adequate sources to tell this in a kind of a narrative scene writing way than it is to select sources to do some of the kinds of argumentation that we might normally do in our scholarly historical output. Because you want details like dialogue, and you want a little bit of detail that helps you do scene setting, and it's been really one of the promises that we made to ourselves and to our readers from the beginning, that any assertion that we make will be supported by a source. So if somebody's hair, if the part's on the right side or the left, and we mention it, then it's in a source. So I read parts of that story of Darius Gray and his experience standing in Heber Woolsey's office and looking out the window at the temple, and he says that the spires were shining. Well, that's supported in a source, and it's a source that we're really excited about is from a really important oral history that we're able to do with Darius. And so sources are really important. And then there are other questions. We're trying to balance stories of leaders and members, of men and women, of people from all different parts of the world, so that this really is a story of the saints. And this is one of the things that really distinguishes this from past attempts to tell the history of the church, is the attention to that kind of balance. And so the team is really careful as we charted out and did our story selection to think along those lines. And what that ends up meaning is that in Volume 3 we spent a lot of time in Europe. Volume 2 we spend some time in the Pacific, because that's when the Pacific missions really take hold and begin to thrive. And that's not to say we don't come back to those places later on, but we have to, because we have some limitations, as big as the books are, we have those limitations. We have to think really carefully about where in the narrative we're going to go to which places, and make sure that we're at least trying to represent the experience of being a Latter-day Saint in these different parts of the world. The one final criteria I'd add is the stories that we select have to, and this is something that we always stress, they have to help us understand some important way that the church was changing and growing over time. And that's a really kind of quintessential and fundamental question that historians want to ask of sources, is how did we get from there to here? How did we find the stories? It's hard to capture this, but we have a large collection of documents and then there are large collections of oral histories, and we continue to do more oral histories. The idea is that there is kind of a value chain, if you want to call it that, in history that starts with people making history to begin with, but then creating sources. But then there's this critical part of collecting sources and collecting them into archives and preserving them. And fortunately for us as a Saints team, that's something that's been going on for a century and a half or really more of church history, is this really concerted effort to keep records. We are a record-keeping people. And so we benefit from that, and we stand on the shoulders of the thousands of people who have created and then donated conserved records of the past. And then we just spent a lot of time with a really talented team of historians sifting through a lot of material.
And then I know, working with my students who are, the college where I teach, one of the things that's most difficult is getting them to cut things out. I'm surprised we don't have a 300-volume history of saints. I mean, but choosing what goes in and what gets left out must be really rough sometimes.
It's painful.
Painful?
Some great material that's been left on the cutting room floor. I will say, though, that our hope going forward is to continue in this same vein. We've learned so much about not just the work of creating sacred history is how we would characterize it, but also the work of writing it in a way that engages audiences and new audiences who maybe wouldn't be otherwise inclined to read history books or listen to history books. And so we want to keep that going. So our hope is to continue to tell stories in this style and publish them in different outlets and venues along the way, so that over time we can say that this is an expanding story. It goes back to the scriptural mandate of the church historian and the Doctrine and Covenants, that is to keep a history continually. And we hope that this is a beginning and one that can serve as a kind of a foundation for more.
Can you think of any other organization that has this extensive, not just history, but history where they're putting it out to the common non-scholar audience? I mean, maybe there are, but I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Sure. Public history is an established discipline within the historical field, and they're people who have been engaged in public history for a long time. We do, I think, take pride in saints as something that is different than most of what you would see out there. And I of course don't have numbers of other books that are published, but I would imagine that this is among the most widely read works of history in the world.
And again, the fact the organization itself put it together, but didn't.
Right.
But you're very careful to make sure everything is documented, and so it's not just a spin propaganda kind of thing. It's actually it's got sources. That's the word. Good sources.
We've tried to be rigorous and careful, and we think it does justice to the history. It's challenging. The tendency is to want to dive into a specific topic or something like that. And so there's a kind of restraint involved in trying to step way back. We're always careful. We don't shy away from difficult topics.
I've noticed that.
And
yes.
So we're going to talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and even in a way that some people say, I probably don't want. Maybe I won't let my children read that chapter. It's a difficult event. Plural marriage and all of the difficulties surrounding that. Even as I narrated a little bit, this challenging history around race and the experience of some Black church members. This is something we put there. We put it on the page, and it's there, and it's important for us to read it, to understand it, to learn from it. There's a power in doing that, and I hope our readers recognize that that telling the whole story, including the challenging bits, it can be an act of devotion in its own way, because even the Book of Mormon tells us, don't condemn us for our imperfections as record keepers, or maybe even as people, but thank the Lord that He's made manifest those imperfections to you, so you can learn to do better than we did. And so, the Mountain Meadows, what can we learn from Mountain Meadows? There are things we can learn, and if we aren't willing to stare some of those challenges in the face and learn the things that we need to learn from them, then maybe we're missing out on something that's important in our lives of discipleship.
I'm also really glad that you included Darius Gray. Darius Gray has spoken at a couple of fair conferences for us. I think more than a couple now that I think about it. But I remember the first time he spoke, Mark Tuttle, who was in church communications at the time, church public affairs, I think it was called back then. After Darius spoke, he said, he leaned over to me and said, "That man has power. That man has gravitas." And it just really, and yet Darius expressed to me the pain he felt as a young man, not being able to participate, and not just not being able to participate in the priesthood, but also as a black man in a predominantly white society, not being able to participate in the dating world and in going out with friends and other things we just don't even, we don't even think about. We take it for granted nowadays. But there's just the lack of inclusion.
There's power in the honesty that he has as he tells his story.
Yeah. I was lucky enough. I was my age a little bit, but I was on my mission when in '78 when the priesthood ban was lifted, and it was interesting. As there were two missionaries in my mission, I was friends with them, Elder Taggy and Elder Frank. And Elder Frank was from Germany. Elder Taggy, he's U.S. I'm not sure where he's from, and they were teaching some African gentlemen. And the day of their baptism, they walked over to pick them up to go baptize them, and they weren't there anymore, and they'd been deported. And so they thought, oh gosh, darn, that just didn't work out, and feel bad. And then they started getting letters from them, and they had joined up with some of these groups down that you have in Saints 4 that you were expressing, the other groups that were meeting together who had not yet had missionaries come. But they sought them out and found them and joined up with them. So it was amazing living during that time. And for me, it's interesting seeing this as a history book, because as I think about it, this is my life. This is things that I watched.
Yeah, and that's the other challenge of this book is that it's especially as we approach the end, it's easier to approach like some a subject of historical inquiry from a greater historical distance.
Right.
For all kinds of reasons. We don't know the end from the beginning. We don't know where things are headed. At the same time, you have a lot of people reviewing these books to the tune of hundreds. And these are extremely carefully vetted books by subject matter experts, by others, including church leaders. And everybody's lived through some piece of it. Mm-hmm. And so you've got these different perspectives that in the process of refining the manuscript is challenging as you get closer to the present, because everybody kind of has their memory, their living memory of what happened, and so we're working to kind of get things reconciled as best we can.
And we all see things through different lenses and different worldviews and such.
Yeah.
I better get some of these other people getting mad at me. First one, really important one. Are you related to Spencer McBride?
Such an important question. Yes, I am. So I joined the church history department in 2011, and then I remember one day several years later walking around the corner, and someone introduced me to Spencer McBride, and I said, "Oh, well, nice to meet you, Spencer." Didn't know him before, but we very quickly discovered that we were fourth cousins and had a shared ancestor who joined the church in New York in 1833. Mm-hmm. And so we sometimes jokingly call each other cousin, but Spencer is a remarkable scholar and a fantastic person to work with.
That's great. Here's another one. I have loved all of the volumes of Saints, and I'm excited to read Volume 4. But when I talk about Saints with members of my ward, most of them have not read them. It would be a huge blessing for our members, especially our youth, to read all of the volumes of Saints. What is the church doing to help encourage members to read Saints, and what can we do at the local level?
Oh, well, thanks for asking that question. I clearly share your assessment there that reading Saints can be a real blessing, especially to young adults, just to be equipped with that kind of understanding. At the same time, they're big. They take time. One thing that I would suggest that you might point them to is the audiobook version. One of the interesting trends that we've noticed with Saints is that when Volume 1 released, about 92% of our users were digital readers or print readers. And by the time we got to Volume 3, about 40% of them were audiobook listeners. And we've seen, I expect to see that trend continued as we approach Volume 4. This is something that whether they're supposed to or not, I know a lot of missionaries who find themselves driving distances between appointments and meetings often will listen to Saints in the car. So I do think that audiobook version is a great way for at least a subset of that audience to engage with the stories. Another thing that we're doing, we're recognizing that although it's important to us as the team that worked on the volumes, that people understand the way that the stories interlock and relate to each other over time. We also recognize that not everybody is going to read the whole book or the whole series, and so one of the things that we're just starting to do now is to take some of those individual stories and publish them as standalone stories on the website and the Gospel Library app. Some of them with short video depictions that they're illustrated and tell some of the stories in a brief way, just as a way of reaching out to that audience that says, I kind of want to learn some of this stuff, but I don't have time for however many 100 pages right now. And so that's one thing that we're trying to do. There are institute classes that have been created and structured around Saints, in particular Volume 1, and I think this is a good way for young adult Latter-day Saints to be introduced to the books and to this history. And one of the things that we've learned in that process is that a far, far, far greater percentage of students in those classes that were assigned to read Saints actually completed the reading coming into the class than maybe the other textbooks that they had used, because they kind of got sucked in once they got started. And that just tells me, if we can just overcome some of maybe a little bit of that stigma of, oh, this is a history book, and get them engaging with the stories and with the people that often they'll keep going. So the trick is to kind of get them started, and hopefully from there.
I had an experience with Southern Baptist Convention. I was in conversation with one of their leadership members, and he said he was a kind of a personal historian. He loved histories and such, and so it would be a really good history to read about the church. So I handed him Volume 1. So I haven't heard back or anything, but I think it's a nice book to hand out to people who have those interests. Yeah. It's blunt sometimes. I mean, it's not sugar coated, but it's accurate. And it sucks you in. The stories are very engaging, I find.
Well, people are interesting.
Yeah.
If you get into history, this is something that you kind of have to enjoy. It's just getting to understand and to learn about and know people.
So this next question, I don't think you know the answer to, but perhaps you can direct this gentleman where he can go. It says, you mentioned the role of Revelation and single sisters serving missions. Mm-hmm. Why do you think the older single LDS men are not allowed to serve proselyting missions while older single women can? Mm-hmm. I've asked many times in many venues and received no answer.
Yeah, I honestly have no idea. But maybe that's a question I need to go try to get to the bottom of.
Okay. And I have a couple here. Joseph Smith's history volumes were originally titled Documentary History of the Church. Do you know when and why that title changed? Joseph Smith's history was originally titled Documentary History.
Says, for a time it was. I mean, its title is History of the Church, and I think that, if I remember right, this idea of documentary history is something that was used in citations to distinguish it perhaps from other histories.
Mm-hmm. And we had two separate History of the Church sets for quite a while. Uh,
Well, are you referring? So both James Roberts is involved in both of the publication of both of them, but one of them is the history that Joseph Smith began with his scribes, and then of course is completed and starts to be published around the turn of the century, and then H. Roberts' comprehensive history,
right.
published in 1930. That's another great question. I don't know. It's not one that I've given a lot of thought to, but I remember seeing it referred to as DHC, Documentary History of the Church, in footnotes, and I'm surmising that that's a way of kind of distinguishing the two. But again, when it was published as History of the Church.
Here's another one. Do you know of any experiences of editors or contributors that have become profoundly affected by a story of a certain person, such as Addison and Louisa Pratt? Because that's an example.
Sure. Every member of that Saints team could talk about a different person that has affected them deeply as they've done the research. And we feel like, I'll say that if I had our lead historian, Jed Woodworth, here, he might tell those stories that would show the way that we feel we've been blessed as a team to identify, to find stories. That's a moving process in and of itself. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but some of the stories that I shared tonight are stories that are really powerful to me. I love the story of, and just picturing Melitone Trejo and Daniel Webster Jones sitting there working on the Book of Mormon, the way that they talk about it, and Trejo's working, and Jones reads it, and he will describe it as a revelatory process, and it kind of gives me the chills. And I think about the way that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery collaborated as the prophet and seer, and then as the scribe, to bring us the Book of Mormon in English. And then I have to think, the Lord's messages to people of all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people. And it's as important to him that the Book of Mormon is translated into Spanish as it is in English. And it's just kind of beautiful for me to think about the Lord's hand being in that. Perhaps not in the same mode or in the same way, but certainly a part of that process. So those are the kinds of things that I think are really moving and stirring to me. There are some incredibly dramatic stories in Saints. We tell a fantastic story in Volume 4 of a time when there's a coup happening in the Philippines, and the Manila Temple and its grounds are at risk. And there's a janitor at the temple who comes and talks to some of the people involved. And we tell a little bit about his story and what we feel is, things that he was able to say and do that ended up protecting the temple. That's a dramatic story. There's so many of them. I've shared with at your conferences previously the story of William Paul Daniels in South Africa, who my heart bleeds for him when I read the story, and I just love him so much as a Black Latter-day in South Africa. And just think about some of the challenges that he faced, and to try to put myself in his shoes. There are just, at this point, dozens and dozens of stories. And like I said, every member of the team is going to share different stories that impact them and that they feel really strongly about.
Well, I want to, as a church member and as president of FAIR, I really want to thank you and your team for doing this work. And I also want to thank you for the topics that you're coming out with. I know I've gotten some comments, FAIR should go away now because the church is coming out with these topics. And my thought is, no, we need these. We need the different perspectives, and we need the information. And I'm really grateful that you guys are putting those out and doing that.
Thank you. And I would echo what you say. There are things that we can do and that we can say and that we can publish. And I think we play a part.
Absolutely.
But the internet is a big kind of unruly jungle sometimes.
Yes.
And we need a lot of faithful voices and a lot of people out there. Frankly, not every answer to every question works well for every person. Mm-hmm. And so, as you suggested, there are perspectives that we all can bring, and we're just kind of that's a work of ministry that we do as we help others. And so it's great to see various organizations kind of weighing in and providing content on these different questions, because it's going to reach different people and different audiences differently, and really hopefully just, help stem a little bit of that tide of some of the information that's less, yeah.
Yeah, I gave some firesides recently, and I was very careful. Not careful. I was very strong in my suggestion that people go and read those topics, because I just recently read the one book of Abraham. I thought was fabulous. It was just really good.
Thanks. Yeah, we've got a really good team of historians working on those as well. I mean, we think it's a nice. It ends up at the end of the day forming something of a little encyclopedia of key events, people, places, and themes and topics in church history that serves as a nice companion to the narrative series.
Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Appreciate all that you do.